Welcome to Workplace Justice. From injuries to compensation, our experts have you covered.
Welcome to Workplace Justice with Dan Davis. I am Sam Henninger, and I'm excited to get to talk with Dan today because we're going to dive in and first start talking about Louisiana's Workers' Compensation Act. So, Dan, would you please explain to us, give an overview of what it is and how that affects people looking to gain benefits from a workplace injury?
Yeah, that's a great way to start, a great question, because the Louisiana Workers' Compensation Act, everyone's first idea about that is that it's there to protect injured workers. And in a sense, it is. Obviously, it provides benefits to injured workers. But I think at the same time, we need to understand that the system developed in reality as a way to protect employers. Imagine if every employer could be sued in civil court for accidents that happened or suffered by their employees. I think the argument would be that it would bankrupt a lot of employers. They can't pay the pain and suffering, the loss of enjoyment of life, all of the things you can get in personal injury cases. If employers were exposed to that, it would affect our economy. It wouldn't be good in a societal sense. But at the same time, you also have workplace accidents often don't come with fault at all. If you know what I mean. People fall off of a scaffold. They lose their balance. They slip on a floor, maybe in some water that they spilled themselves. And so there's a couple of things. There's a couple of trade-offs here. One is when someone's injured at work, we don't have the same rights against our employers as we might have against someone who hits me from behind in a motor vehicle. But at the same time, we also don't have to prove that there's any fault anywhere. If a person is injured at work in Louisiana, and I think this is true in just about every state, fault doesn't matter, and they can't file a tort or personal injury claim in connection with that accident against their own employer, absent some very limited circumstances that we won't even talk about here. They're so rare. So what you do have in the workers' compensation scheme of Louisiana is a system that guarantees injured workers a couple of things. The first is the right to control their own medical treatment. Anyone who's injured on the job in Louisiana, one of the most important rights they have is to pick their own doctor and pick in any specialty they need. And it's often more than one specialty. If we have a construction worker who falls off of a roof, and I've got one we're working on this morning. We just met him over the weekend. He contacted me Saturday. He's got a spinal injury. He's got a leg injury. His foot is injured. His wrist is injured. Those are all going to be different doctors. I didn't get the sense that he knows of any doctors in particular, so we're going to help him choose those different specialties. So that's the first thing. The injured worker is going to control their own medical treatment, and then they're going to be helped economically by the workers' compensation, the employer or its insurer. If they can't work because of the injury, they are paid a weekly indemnity benefit. And the benefit is generally 2/3 of your pre-accident earnings. If you're making, and it's capped, it's not unlimited. And this year's just over $800 a week is the cap. But if you're making $1,000 a week prior to the accident, then you're going to get $666.67 every week from the workers' comp insurer. That can change over time. During a case, people who can't work at all sometimes get released to work, but only in a limited capacity by their doctor. And maybe at that point, they can't earn as much as they were making prior to the accident. So then there's a supplemental earnings benefit that they're able to get during the time when they're working, but they can't make as much as they did before. So those are the two major benefits, the medical and the indemnity side in Louisiana's workers' compensation system.
Maybe you could comment a bit on how these benefits stack up against what many of your clients face in real life. Are these adequate for most people, or how does this time frame look for them when it comes to recovery and getting back to how they were prior to the incident?
First of all, the workers' compensation system in Louisiana, and I'm pretty sure just about everywhere else, it wasn't designed and shouldn't be designed to make anybody rich. No one got rich off of a workers' compensation case, and nor should they necessarily. That's not the point. The point is to get that person the medical treatment, the economic help they need and get them back to work. Now, we have catastrophic accidents. We have accidents where people just never can go back to work, or at least not back in the same capacity. I've had clients paralyzed from the neck down, from the waist down, multiple clients. And those clients are going to have a lifetime often of help from a workers' compensation insurer. Luckily, the benefits are scaled in some sense every year. The maximum amount of indemnity benefits you can get per week goes up a little bit. So it is meant to, it's not locked in some 1980s at some 1980s rate or some rate that was created years ago. It does keep getting better. And we watch that with the state legislature and in connection with lobbyists to make sure that those benefits continue to progress with the state of Louisiana.
Well, and I find it interesting, in a previous episode, you had mentioned how a case you had worked on, you were able to have a case for workers' comp as well as personal injury. And we had talked about how I think a lot of people have in their mind they're going to file a personal injury, or that's their case and that's what they expect their benefits to be around. But what you're saying is workers' comp is here to not just to minimize the impact on the employer for those workplace injuries, but really to give a solid way forward for proving those cases. Because as you said, there's no fault involved with workers' comp. So maybe you just speak a little bit more to delineate those two types of claims.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the things we have to explain right off the bat, and with some clients, it's an explanation that it keeps being given throughout the case. They're convinced that, look, I had an accident. I know someone else. This is very common. I know someone else who had a similar accident, and they had the exact same surgery that I had. They had a back surgery, and that person got $1 million. And we have to talk them through, well, what kind of case did that other person have? If the other person was injured in an accident, an auto accident, maybe a truck hit them, and there was plenty of insurance, then a spinal injury claim could certainly be worth $1 million. We handle those accidents as well at our firm. But the reason workers' compensation clients ultimately can get money in many cases at the end of their case is completely different from a personal injury case. In a personal injury case, you are en route to a trial. You're going to go to court unless you settle your case. You're going to go to court and you're going to ask a jury to award you money for your pain, money for your lost time, maybe with your family, your suffering, your past medical expenses, your future medical expenses. All of that stuff goes in front of a impaneled jury, and they look at it and they decide among themselves how much your claim is worth and what they're going to award you. That doesn't happen in workers' comp. There is no court to go to. There's no trial. We do have a workers' compensation court that resolves little disputes that happen along the way. Like if they don't approve a particular doctor, we can go in front of a workers' compensation judge, explain the case, and the judge decides, do we get to see a doctor of this particular specialty? If we don't agree about the weekly amount the client is getting, then we can go in front of the workers' compensation court and the judge can say, Dan, you're right, your client should be getting $800 a week instead of the $400 a week the insurance company's trying to pay them. Other than those little disputes, there's not a trial that will ever happen in workers' compensation. The reason that a workers' comp client can get money at the end of his case is once the doctor has done everything possible for the person. They put them at what we call maximum medical improvement, MMI. They say it's a legal jargon. You've heard it before. Once the person is put at MMI by the doctor, meaning there's nothing left to do. You may have some ongoing maintenance treatment, but in the sense of surgeries and therapy, we've done everything possible. You have improved the most you can, but that person still can't work in the same job. They can't earn what they earned before. Then that indemnity benefit we talked about, that can go on. That will keep going. Maybe they can go back to work in a diminished earning capacity. So the insurance company still has to pay them weekly. And maybe the doctor says, even though you're at MMI, you've improved as much as possible, you'll still need injections, for example. You'll need some kind of epidural steroid injection for pain in the future, or you'll need medicine over the course of your lifetime. So now the workers' compensation case is still open. right? The workers' comp insurer still has these obligations, an ongoing obligation of weekly indemnity benefits and an ongoing obligation to pay any medical treatment related to your accident. Well, at that point, since the doctor has said you've improved as much as possible and you can go back to work in some capacity, or maybe you can't go back to work, you've kind of fixed what the client is entitled to, and we can negotiate, if the insurance company is willing, those future benefits and settle it with a lump sum payment from the insurance company to the client that resolves their workers' compensation case once and for all and closes that case. And so that is the difference. There's in the personal injury side, you've got trials and juries and awards of judgments. In workers' comp, you get better ideally, and if there's some remaining obligation by that insurance company that is ongoing, maybe for the next 10 years or maybe for your lifetime, then you're free to negotiate with the insurance company a resolution of those future obligations. And that's how a workers' compensation claimant, unlike a personal injury claimant, can get a lump sum at the end of the day. It's not awarded to them in any sense. It is a negotiation with the insurance company.
One thing you mentioned is how the employer is required to pay for the medical expenses related to the injury. Is that correct?
Correct. So these laws are written generally in a broad sense. Workers' compensation laws are written about the obligations of the employer to the employee. Those obligations are picked up by the employer's insurance company. Kind of like driving a car, right? If I hit you, I am obligated to fix whatever I did to your car and to pay Dan Davis. It's my obligation. But by law, I'm required to have automobile insurance. And in the same sense, employers are required to have workers' compensation insurance. So the insurance company is who ultimately generally has the obligation in one of the cases that we're handling, outside of the rare case where someone is either self-insured or uninsured, in which case it is the employer paying the obligation.
And you had mentioned several times now that when it comes to the indemnity benefit, is that what it's called?
That's it.
You're entitled to 2/3 of what your pre-injury income was. Is that correct?
That's what you're entitled to during the time when you can't work at all. If your doctor says, if the treating physician says this person should not work at this time. So I've got a guy right now where we're handling his case and he needs a back surgery. And we're fighting with the insurance company over the very necessity of the back surgery. But during that time, the doctor has said he should not be working. He's a construction worker. He shouldn't be working. So the insurance company has to pay him 2/3 of his pre-accident wages during this whole time. That can change. So that is a total disability indemnity benefit. But that can be converted into what we call SEB, supplemental earnings benefit. If the doctor says, you're injured, you can't go back to what you were doing before, but you could do some light duty work. Okay, so you've got maybe a welder who was making $75 an hour, now has to stay seated and work in an office, and he can make $20 an hour. So that you have these differentials. Supplemental earnings benefit kicks in when you can work, but you make less than you could before. And in that case, the calculation, and I know you're never supposed to do math live on the air, but the calculation is essentially 2/3 of the difference between what you were making before and what you can make now. Okay, so if I was making $1,000 a week before my accident, and now they've got me seated in an office making $400 a week, a $10 an hour, 40-hour a week job, well, now the difference is $600. The insurance company has to pay me 2/3 of that. So $400 a week, although it's paid SEB, unlike total temporary disability. SEB, supplemental earnings benefits, are paid monthly, not weekly.
Now, you had mentioned before that there have been cases that you've handled where there's a discrepancy between what they should be getting and what they are getting, given these benefits. How does that typically occur? How is there any reason that there should be such a mistake?
It happens in a lot of ways. And this isn't true with every insurance company, but a lot of times someone comes to me, they've already started getting a check, and the insurance company, it could be something honest and simple, like the employer hasn't sent us the wages yet. All right. So but the insurance company at the same time doesn't want to just take my client's word for it that, hey, I was making $20 an hour. I worked 50 hours a week. I made whatever, $1,200 with overtime, whatever it might be. And so they come in and they're making some depressed rate, and we have to demand the wage records from the employer, and then show the insurance company how it should be calculated. In other cases, it could be that the person wasn't making overtime, wasn't being paid overtime illegally, not being paid overtime. And so a 50-hour work week at $20 an hour is only getting them $1,000. Well, they should have been getting more than $1,000. And the Louisiana Supreme Court says that if the employer is not complying with, we call this the Fair Labor Standard Act, it's the federal law that requires you to pay overtime and minimum wage and different things, then that indemnity benefit must be calculated as if the employer were complying with the federal overtime law. There's just so many different variations that can happen, but those are a couple of examples.
Dan, you had mentioned previously that you've handled cases where someone had lost their life, and working through that, getting the benefits that those who survived them were entitled to. Could you explain a bit more of how those types of cases work?
Yeah, those are important cases. They're impactful. And as you know from previous episode, we represent a lot of Hispanic workers and they're often in some of the most dangerous jobs in our state. But we've of course handled these cases with non-Hispanic workers and any number of different types of clients. But when someone dies in Louisiana on the job, their survivors are left with a workers' compensation claim. These cases can be a little complicated, but there's essentially a schedule of benefits that are available to someone who has lost a family member to a work accident in Louisiana. And in a lot of the cases that I've had, the majority of them, the person dies here in Louisiana, but their relative is out of the country. Our first one was in Guatemala. I'm going to Nicaragua next week to meet the mother of a dead injured worker here in Louisiana. I've been to El Salvador, Mexico. We've had a couple of cases where the survivors were in Mexico. So if a person dies and they are married and their spouse is dependent on them, but they have no children, the spouse is going to receive a percentage of that person's income for the rest of his or her life. Right now, that percentage is 32.5% of their average weekly wage. They'll get that weekly until the surviving spouse dies or remarries. And that can be, the one I'm going to meet with next week in Managua is she had her child young. She's only 39 years old, the mother, and she's going to get a weekly benefit. If she lives until 80, she'll get it until she's 80, and lives to be 100. She'll get that. And so it's if the surviving spouse has a child, then the spouse and child get an additional percentage, and the child will receive that additional amount until they turn 18, or if they continue with their education, it can go all the way to age 23. It goes like that. If the person doesn't have any surviving spouse, children, then the parents get a one-time lump sum payment. Right now, that's a $75,000 payment to each parent. And the cases can get really, really interesting. The one that I'm working on right now, and without obviously talking about any details about it, but the insurance company would love to pay the surviving parent the $75,000 one-time benefit and just close the case. But this parent is economically dependent on her child. So that changes the case. If the parent is not dependent on the child, like I've got a child who is working, I'm not financially dependent on him. If he were to die in the course and scope of his work, I would get the $75,000 payment. But if I'm, as a parent, if I'm financially, partially or totally financially dependent on my child, I'm going to get a weekly benefit for the rest of my life, or until I would otherwise be expected not to be dependent anymore. But in this case, we've told the insurance company, we're not interested in the $75,000. You owe this woman a weekly amount for the rest of her life. And she's only 38, so that's going to go for a long time. And while we're at it, the girl here was sending money back not just to her mother, but to support her siblings. So they are also partially financially dependent on her and are going to get this weekly benefit. So I find these cases to be super interesting. I talk about them on my call-in show here in Baton Rouge precisely because I have found that particularly with a Hispanic employee here in Louisiana, this has happened multiple times at my firm with me, the employer and the insurance company try to get that body sent back to Latin America, and that's it. They don't want to, they're not trying to find spouses, parents, siblings, anyone who might be entitled to benefits. They want to just get that body back to Honduras, to Mexico, wherever it might be bound, and then hope no one ever shows up and says, hey, you gotta support that family. So they're hard cases, they're difficult cases. It's hard to talk to the person who's recently bereaved, but at the same time, I find those cases to be just so important.
I've learned so much from this conversation and one's previous. And what's speaking out to me right now is just how, I wouldn't say complicated, maybe it is just flat out complicated to navigate some of these laws and the way the legal system operates through those laws. Because as you were saying, there are going to be other parties who may be on the hook for benefits owed to you that they aren't interested necessarily in making sure your case is handled the right way. So it's important to have someone on your side who knows how to work through the system and get things going and advocate for you, because there's going to be so many little details that people won't be sad if you miss them.
You're absolutely right about that. When I started doing this practice 10 years ago, my law partner who had already been doing workers' comp, and he's very good at workers' compensation, Randy, who you'll meet in future episodes, I picked up on this. He would always say to people who were looking at a potential, someone as their attorney, he'd say, look, with a workers' compensation case, you need an attorney. It doesn't have to be me. It doesn't have to be our firm. But do yourself a favor and get an attorney, because the insurance company and the employer are not looking to do you favors. And every company is different. I've absolutely had cases where they were already working with an insurance company and the insurance company was doing everything to a T just right. But in many other cases, they came and, whether it's through an honest mistake or some miscalculation, the person's not getting everything that they're meant to get under Louisiana Workers Compensation Act. So it's just safer and better to be guided by an attorney in that process.
This has been Workplace Justice with Dan Davis. I'm Sam Henniger. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And Dan, why don't you let people know where they can find you on radio?
Well, if you're in Baton Rouge, you can listen to 105.5 FM. I'm sure they have an app. If you Google 105.5 in Baton Rouge, it's the Spanish radio network. I'm there at 7:30 a.m. every Friday morning, unless I'm traveling or otherwise gone, and then we'll try to do it by phone. But it's a joy to do. I have a good time with that, and that's how you can dial in there.
Well, thank you again, Dan.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.